Christy Mirack had a way of making people feel seen. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was something quieter, the kind of presence that lingered long after a conversation ended. To her students, she was the teacher who noticed when someone was struggling before they ever raised a hand. To her family, she was dependable, thoughtful, and deeply rooted in routine. To friends, she was warm without being overbearing, structured without being rigid. She was 36 years old in December of 1992, living alone in a modest townhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and by all outward measures, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Until one morning, when she didn't show up for work. Christy was born in 1956 and raised in Lancaster County, an area defined by its contrast, farmland stretching into the distance alongside tightly knit suburban neighborhoods. Her childhood unfolded in a stable home surrounded by family who valued education, responsibility, and consistency. From a young age, Christy gravitated towards structure. She liked plans, schedules, lists, the reassurance of knowing what came next. That sense of order would later define her adult life. In school, she was known as diligent rather than flashy. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was observant. Teachers noted her reliability. Friends described her as thoughtful, sometimes reserved, but deeply loyal once trust was built. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't chase chaos. Teaching wasn't a sudden calling, it was a natural progression. After college, Christy returned to the Lancaster area and began working as an elementary school teacher. She taught fourth grade, an age where children balanced curiosity with vulnerability. It suited her. She was patient, she was prepared, she was consistent. Parents trusted her instinctively, and administrators saw her as dependable, the kind of teacher who didn't need supervision to do her job well. Her classroom reflected her personality, organized, calm, welcoming. By the early 1990s, Christy had settled into a steady routine. She lived alone in a townhouse in the small community of Mountjoy Township. The neighborhood was quiet, familiar, the kind of place where people noticed when a porch light stayed on too long or when someone's car hadn't moved in days. Christy liked it that way. She wasn't married and didn't have children, but she was close with her family and maintained an active social circle. She had friends from work, attended gatherings, and kept in touch with loved ones. There was nothing about her life that suggested instability or risk, which is why when she failed to arrive at school on the morning of December 21st, 1992, concern set in almost immediately. Christy was not late. She did not miss work without notice. She did not ignore responsibilities, and she did not disappear. When colleagues couldn't reach her by phone, administrators contacted her family. When family members drove to her home and saw her car still parked outside, unease deepened into fear. What they found inside would mark one of the most haunting unsolved murders in Pennsylvania history, a case that would remain frozen in time for more than 25 years. The weekend before Christy Mirack was killed unfolded without drama, which, in hindsight, made its silence all the more unsettling. Those who saw her in the days leading up to December 21st remembered nothing out of the ordinary. She went about her routine with the same predictability she always had. She prepared lesson plans, she spoke with family, she moved through familiar spaces without fear or hesitation. There were no reports of arguments, no visible stressors, no known threats. Nothing that suggested danger was approaching her front door. Christy's townhouse sat in a quiet residential development, the kind of place where sounds carried easily and strangers stood out. Her neighbors were mostly families and working professionals, many of whom kept similar schedules. Doors were locked, but the area was not known for violent crime. It was not a neighborhood where residents expected the unthinkable to happen inside their homes. On the evening of December 20th, Christy spent time preparing for the upcoming school week. The holiday break was approaching, and like many teachers, she was tying up loose ends before time off. Her car remained parked in its usual spot. There was no evidence she went out late or met with anyone unexpectedly. Whatever happened next occurred within the ordinary rhythms of her life, which made the violence that followed even more jarring. Sometime during the night or early morning hours, Christy encountered her killer. Investigators would later struggle to pinpoint an exact timeline, but the scene inside the townhouse told a grim story. There were signs of a violent struggle, furniture displaced, items knocked over, indications that Christy fought back. This was not a sudden, silent attack. It was prolonged, physical, desperate. Christy was overpowered. The assault culminated in her death by strangulation, a method that required sustained, intimate force. This was not a weapon used from a distance. It meant her killer was close enough to feel resistance fade, close enough to witness the final moments of her life. The autopsy later confirmed that the force applied was significant, leaving no doubt about the brutality involved. After killing her, the attacker did not immediately flee. Evidence suggested he remained in the townhouse long enough to move through the space, leaving behind a chaotic mixture of physical clues and unanswered questions. Some areas appeared disturbed, while others remained eerily untouched, as if the killer moved with purpose rather than panic. There was no sign of forced entry, a detail that would haunt investigators for decades. By the time the sun rose on December 21st, Christy Mirack lay dead inside her own home. Her absence at school that morning was the first alarm. When family members arrived and entered the townhouse, the sense of dread became reality. They found Christy's body inside, the scene unmistakably violent. Emergency responders and law enforcement were called immediately, transforming the quiet residential street into an active crime scene. Detectives from the local police department arrived alongside state investigators. The house was sealed, photographs were taken, evidence was carefully cataloged. The stillness of the neighborhood was replaced by flashing lights and whispered conversations as word spread that a teacher had been murdered just steps from where families lived their everyday lives. Inside the townhouse, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstruction. They documented the signs of struggle, the location of Christy's body, and the absence of obvious burglary. Valuables remained. There was no clear motive in sight. This was not a crime that fit neatly into a known category, and that ambiguity would define the investigation for years to come. Forensic technicians collected biological evidence, including material recovered from Christy's body. At the time, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy. While samples were preserved, their future value was uncertain. Still, investigators followed protocol, unaware that decades later, those fragments would become the key to unlocking the truth. As news of the murder spread, the community recoiled. Parents struggled with fear, teachers mourned one of their own, students returned to classrooms with substitute instructors and unanswered questions. The idea that someone could enter a home like Christie's without forced entry, without immediate detection, shattered the sense of safety people had taken for granted. Behind closed doors, detectives worked through the first wave of possibilities. They examined Christy's social circle, her coworkers, her daily habits. They looked for anyone who might have had access to her home or knowledge of her routines. Interviews were conducted methodically, each one logged, each detail scrutinized. Yet with every passing day, the case grew more complicated rather than clearer. There was no obvious suspect. And with that realization, Christy Mirack's murder began its long, slow transition from a fresh crime into a lingering mystery, one that would test the limits of patience, science, and time itself. In the days immediately following Christy Mirack's murder, investigators believed answers would come quickly. Violent crimes like this, especially those involving prolonged physical contact, often left behind a trail, a mistake, a witness, a motive that surfaced once pressure was applied. Detectives expected the case to break open within weeks. Instead, it began to close in on itself. The initial focus centered on Christy's routines. Every hour of her day was reconstructed backward, starting with the morning she failed to appear at school. Co-workers were interviewed in detail, not just about her schedule, but about her demeanor. Had she seemed distracted? Was she nervous? Had she mentioned plans or concerns? The answers were consistent. Christy had been herself, calm, prepared, forward-looking. Friends and family echoed the same sentiment. There were no romantic partners hidden from view, no turbulent relationships simmering beneath the surface. Christy was private, but not secretive. She didn't bring chaos into her life, and she didn't associate with people who did. That absence of obvious conflict troubled investigators. With no forced entry and no theft, detectives explored the possibility that Christy knew her killer, or at least had allowed him inside willingly. Doors were examined closely, locks were tested, windows were checked for tampering. Nothing suggested a break-in. The house did not appear ransacked in the way a burglary gone wrong might look. Instead, the disarray seemed concentrated, purposeful, tied to the struggle itself. Attention shifted to people who might have crossed Christy's path casually rather than intimately. Maintenance workers, delivery drivers, service technicians, anyone who could have had legitimate access to the townhouse complex was identified and tracked down. Employment records were pulled, alibis were checked. Many were eliminated quickly. Others lingered longer, their timelines incomplete or vague, though nothing concrete tied them to the scene. At the same time, forensic analysis continued quietly in the background. The autopsy confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, with physical findings consistent with a prolonged assault. Defensive injuries told investigators Christy had fought hard. This was not a passive victim. She resisted, clawed, and struggled, leaving open the possibility that her attacker had been scratched or injured in the process. Yet no one reported unexplained injuries in the days after the murder. Biological evidence collected from Christy's body was carefully preserved. Semen was identified, a critical finding that immediately elevated the importance of forensic testing. But in 1992, DNA databases were limited, and forensic comparison depended heavily on having a known suspect to test against. Without that, the evidence became something to store rather than deploy. As weeks turned into months, the investigation widened. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood repeatedly. Residents were asked if they had heard noises during the night, a scream, a crash, a car engine at an unusual hour. Most reported nothing. A few recalled vague sounds but couldn't place a time or context. Nothing rose to the level of probable cause. Tips trickled in. Some were sincere. Others were fueled by fear and speculation. Names surfaced, then faded. Each lead demanded time, energy, and verification, and each ultimately collapsed under scrutiny. The case began to stagnate. By the mid-1990s, Christy Mirack's murder was officially considered a cold case, though the file remained active. Detectives rotated in and out. New eyes reviewed old reports. Evidence was re-examined. Timelines were rebuilt. Still, the same problem remained. There was no suspect who fit all the facts. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA testing improved. Investigators periodically revisited the evidence, hopeful that new methods might unlock answers hidden in samples collected decades earlier. But without a match in existing databases, the profile remained anonymous, a ghost attached to a violent act. For Christy's family, time did not soften the loss, it merely stretched it. Each year without answers deepened the wound. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. The house where Christy had been killed was eventually occupied by others, but the memory of what happened there never fully faded from the community's consciousness. By the early 2000s, genetic databases used by law enforcement were growing, but still limited. Convicted offenders were added, but if Christy's killer had never been arrested for a qualifying crime, his DNA would not appear. Investigators faced a sobering reality. The man who killed her might live an ordinary life, unmarked by the justice system, invisible to the tools available at the time. Despite that, the case was never closed. Evidence remained preserved, notes were kept, and quietly, advances in forensic genealogy began to emerge, a new frontier that would eventually transform cold case investigations across the country. But for years, that breakthrough remained just out of reach. Christy Mirack's name stayed on a list, unsolved, unresolved, waiting, until a decision made decades after her death finally shifted the trajectory of the case. By the mid-2010s, the Mirack case had reached a crossroads that many cold cases never survive. The evidence still existed. The biological material collected in 1992 had been preserved with care. The paperwork was intact. The timelines were solid. What investigators lacked was not effort or commitment. It was a tool powerful enough to bridge the gap between an unknown DNA profile and a real human name. That tool arrived quietly. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were beginning to experiment with forensic genetic genealogy, a method that did not rely on criminal databases alone. Instead of waiting for a suspect's DNA to appear after an arrest, investigators could now compare crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, searching for distant relatives rather than exact matches. It was a painstaking process, part science, part deduction, and entirely dependent on patience. In Lancaster County, detectives made the decision to try. The DNA recovered from Christy Mirack's body was reanalyzed using modern techniques, producing a profile far more detailed than anything available in the early 1990s. That profile was then submitted for genealogical comparison. What came back was not a name, but a web, a network of genetic connections stretching across family trees that had nothing obvious to do with Christy Mirack. At first, the results were overwhelming. Distant cousins, shared ancestors, branches that forked and disappeared. Analysts worked backward, narrowing possibilities, eliminating entire family lines based on age, location, and opportunity. It was slow, deliberate work. Every assumption had to be verified. Every conclusion had to withstand scrutiny. Months passed as genealogists and detectives collaborated, gradually funneling the possibilities down to a smaller and smaller group of men who fit the profile. Eventually, one name rose above the rest: Raymond Eugene Rowe. Rowe was not someone who had ever appeared on investigators' radar in 1992. He had no known connection to Christy Mirack. He had not lived in her immediate neighborhood. There was no dramatic backstory linking them together, and that, paradoxically, made him dangerous. He was exactly the kind of offender who slipped through early investigative nets. At the time of the murder, Rowe had worked as a disc jockey, moving through social spaces, events, and communities with ease. He was familiar with homes, routines, and the quiet confidence that came with blending in. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about him that would have drawn suspicion decades earlier. But the genetic trail did not lie. Before making any move, investigators built their case carefully. They reconstructed Rowe's life in 1992, mapping his movements, his employment, and his proximity to Christy Mirack's townhouse. They examined whether he had access to the area, whether his schedule could align with the window of time during which the murder occurred. Everything lined up. Still, suspicion was not enough. Detectives needed confirmation, a direct DNA comparison that would stand up in court. In 2018, investigators conducted covert surveillance. Items discarded by Rowe in public were collected quietly, legally, and sent for testing. When the results came back, there was no ambiguity. The DNA matched. After more than 25 years, the biological evidence taken from Christy Mirack's body finally had a name attached to it. Raymond Eugene Rowe was arrested and charged with her murder. For the investigators who had worked the case for years, some of whom had retired, others who had inherited the file, the moment was heavy rather than triumphant. There was relief, yes, validation too, but there was also the weight of time. Christy Mirack had been 36 when she died. She had been gone longer than she had been alive. The arrest sent ripples through the community. A man who had lived quietly, openly, without suspicion, was now exposed as the person responsible for one of the county's most haunting crimes. The realization unsettled people, not because the danger was new, but because it had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Rowe was taken into custody without incident. During questioning, investigators relied less on confrontation and more on evidence. They laid out timelines, they explained the science, they let the weight of inevitability settle in. This was not an interrogation built on pressure alone, it was built on certainty. The case no longer depended on memory or testimony, it depended on biology. And biology does not forget. From that point forward, the path to conviction became procedural rather than mysterious. The decades-long silence was finally broken not by a witness or a confession, but by the very evidence the killer had left behind on the worst night of Christy Mirack's life. With the mystery finally resolved, the legal process moved forward quickly compared to the decades of silence that preceded it. Raymond Eugene Rowe was charged with criminal homicide and related offenses stemming from Christy Mirack's death. Prosecutors relied heavily on the forensic evidence, particularly the DNA match, which formed the backbone of the case. Unlike older prosecutions built on eyewitnesses or circumstantial theories, this case rested on science that directly tied Rowe to the assault and murder. There was little room for alternative explanations. Faced with the strength of the evidence, Rowe ultimately entered a guilty plea in 2019, formally admitting responsibility for Christy Mirack's murder. The plea spared Christy's family a prolonged trial, but did not lessen the gravity of what had occurred. More than 25 years after her death, the truth was finally spoken in open court. Raymond Eugene Rowe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Christy Mirack's family, the verdict did not bring closure in the conventional sense. Nothing could restore what had been taken, but it brought finality. The unanswered questions that had haunted them for decades were replaced by a definitive truth. The person who killed Christy was no longer an abstract threat or an unknown figure. He had a name, a face, and a prison cell. Raymond Eugene Rowe remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence. Christy Mirack's case is now remembered not only as a brutal and senseless murder, but as a landmark example of how preserved evidence and advancing science can resurrect justice long after hope appears lost. Christy Mirack did not get to grow older. She did not get to finish the life she was building, but her case stands as proof that time does not erase accountability, and that even decades later, the truth can still be uncovered.